But today, I am here with Zoe Vexed. Zoe Vexed is another YouTuber who does a lot of stuff where LGBTQ rights are concerned here on YouTube. And today we're going to be doing a little bit of conversing about the Equality Act, because I know that I've done a handful of episodes defending the Equality Act from straw man arguments from people like Ben Shapiro and other YouTubers here on the platform. But what I haven't done is sat down and actually outlined, outside of, very, very briefly, what it does and why. So I figured that for that, we would go ahead and bring in somebody who has done a little more work on that front so that they can maybe help you. So with that said, I'm going to be done trying to introduce, because I am not very good at that. Zoe, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself? Woo!
Yes, I am Zoe Vexed. How are you, everybody? I am a very small YouTube streamer. I have started my channel, only recently. I am an atheist. I talk a lot about politics, and I am well, I guess you could call me an LGBT activist, as some people might say. But I mainly focus on like politics, current events, that kind of stuff, especially whenever it involves, anything that has to do with like gay rights or any of that sort of thing.
Okay. Well, I know that for me, a lot of that stuff ended up becoming I kind of springboarded into a lot of that when I started out just doing atheist content, because what tended to happen was that conservative arguments about nationalism and what have you all ended up having the exact same bent as their arguments about religiosity, how it was the backbone of the nation, how America would fail without it, how if we didn't have God, then everything was going to fall to the overwhelmingly satanic power of the gays in Pokemon or something. It was always some weird way of arguing that there's some witchcrafty nonsense to progressivism, basically.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's very frustrating that it just seems like continuously conservatives want to kind of like malign minority groups, whether it's people of color, women, LGBT people. They always want to act like, our rights and granting us like the same types of like protections under the law as they are already granted somehow threatens them, as if like you could ever infringe on someone else's rights and liberty by simply extending those liberties to other citizens.
So what seems to grab me awkwardly is how whenever you try to ask a conservative in some way, shape, or form, why one of these changes is going to ruin the nation, why it's going to take us down the evil path to socialism, or whatever way they try to demonize it, it seems like their answer is always some form of slippery slope fallacy. Like, first we allow the whites to marry the blacks, and then we're going to allow the gays to marry the gays, and then, once that's done, then we're going to allow the trans people to have power, and once that happens, and, like, they basically name a bunch of this slippery slope stuff, and it all sounds fine, but somehow, and this is I don't know if you've noticed this, but they always seem to end with, like, bestiality or something.
Yeah.
It always ends up as like, if we allow the gays to have marriage, then eventually we'll have bestiality. Like, wait, I was following you for a while. How did we get here?
Yeah, well, I mean, that historically they've used those exact same arguments. They always want to, basically, think of the children and insinuate. They used to do this all the time in the 60s. They would insinuate that, gay men are somehow like predators. And then when they realized like those arguments were no longer as successful, then, like you said, they're like, oh, well, if you can, if two men can get married, then what's next? Like marrying a horse? And it's like, it's very weird that you would immediately go from like, just giving like, once again, just a minority community, the same rights and privileges that everyone else enjoys. They automatically think that means that you're going to go to like the most absurd thing that you could.
The other thing that you mentioned, the trying to argue that like gay men are predators. What's funny is that they've adapted that argument. That argument is used against trans people now. Like,
oh yeah,
they just use that and they just go, oh, well, if we allow them into the bathrooms, then we're going to have men sexually assaulting women. And like, well, first of all, that's not new. That's bad. It's a thing that we shouldn't be happy about. But like, that already happens in bathrooms right now. Telling trans people not to go to the bathroom that conforms with their gender identity isn't going to somehow magically stop that from happening. It's not like it's not like there's like a rapist who just goes around desperately hoping that wherever he goes, there's not going to be a no raping sign somewhere that will tell him not to do that. It's like conservatives live in Dora the Explorer, and all thieves are Swiper, and all rapists are some version of Swiper like that. Just like, you can't just go, no, you can't do this, and suddenly they'll go, oh, drat, and walk away.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. When these subjects come up, I really have to try not to get like very passionate about it, because it does like absolutely infuriate me that it's this kind of like, recycled bigotry over and over again, where with the argument being that, oh, well, trans women are predators, whatever. It's like, all right, I am a trans woman. This stuff affects me all the time. And like you said, conservatives are very quick to understand that putting up a sign like, this is a gun-free zone or something like that isn't going to stop someone from coming over there and like, committing a crime with a gun. So when you're saying we're going to, keep trans women out of these bathrooms and that'll stop the predators from getting in, it's like, first of all, like how many, like majority of predators are unfortunately cis het men. And we wouldn't argue that we should ban men from any space just based on them being cis het. Like, you shouldn't be discriminating people just based on like, intrinsic inherent traits about themselves, especially if you're trying to say like, they're in the same category, like say like trans women are women, right? They're in the same category as women, but you're trying to discriminate against them specifically because you're trying to, create this kind of a fear mongering, like, oh my God, like if we let them in there, they're just going to go and assault all these people. And it's like, I mean, I'd hate to break it to them, but I don't know if they've noticed, trans women, like we are not like running around just assaulting people. If you want to see that, you definitely have to kind of look at the other side.
So that does kind of lead into another issue, and that is that, from my understanding, the Equality Act, as it's been framed right now, is very much basically just extending rights that already existed for racial minorities and moving those rights to also apply to gendered minorities. This is a thing that happened with what was it, last year? I want to say it was. I believe it was last year, under the Supreme Court that Trump had basically stacked in his favor. Conservative Supreme Court went, yes, we should actually extend worker protection to LGBTQ people under the basis that all of the factors we use to determine somebody's LGBTQ are identical to the factors we use for determining race. The construction's identical. They're just as immutable of things. They're things that people don't have any control over. Therefore, we shouldn't have workplace discrimination as a result of those things. Because we had that standard there, it baffles me to hear issues about the Equality Act when the Equality Act is functionally doing the same thing. It's taking previously packaged rights that existed for racial minorities and just giving them to gendered minorities in the exact same way that, the argument about workers' rights was when the Supreme Court said it was perfectly okay. But I think that's where I'm going to throw it to you and maybe give you as much time as you need to go into what specifically the Equality Act does, how it does it, and with that, I'll just give you the floor.
Well, sure. The Equality Act, as you stated, takes the exact protections that already exist for categories of minorities, such as like race, ethnicity, gender, that sort of thing. And then it extends them. But the Equality Act extends it specifically with sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity in the areas of public accommodation, facilities, education, federal funding, employment, housing, credit, jury systems. Specifically, it will include those things among the already protected categories to stop discrimination or segregation. And there's basically like three major areas where you'll hear disagreement from conservatives. They'll claim that, it violates their freedom of religion, their freedom of speech and women's rights. Do you want to kind of dig into why each one of those is is garbage?
So I know that the women's rights thing is almost always going to boil down to it being an issue with trans women. They're going to look at trans women and go, trans women are gaining rights. That's an affront to. They're going to use real women or biological women or whatever way they want to argue it. They're going to try to argue it in some way that seems either immutable or in a way that, like, all the conservative people around them are going to nod their heads and go, yes, 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 that is correct. So I'm pretty sure that's we're already going to get that. But if you want to go into each one of those, we'll go ahead. Let's go ahead and start with why it apparently is an affront with women's rights and work backwards from there.
Sure. So on the women's rights front, you're exactly right. It's basically like turf talking points in this, and they're essentially appealing to biological essentialism, where they're saying that, you know, if you were born male, there's something like inherent about you that makes you that thing, and you'll always be that thing, no matter, you know, I mean, no matter what, they will not grant anything. If you ask them, like, well, what if you were on HRT and, you know, you went through like an entire transition process up to and including, like, you know, bottom surgery, some will still deny. They'll say, nope, 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 never, because, you know, of this essential area. But I've, you know, made a video before about essentialism, and I try to point out then that social constructionism explains, like, our gender and the way that we understand that portion of our identity much better than anything else. And then you have kind of this performativism, which Judith Butler wrote about as like the third the third aspect of it with biology. If there is anything at all to being trans that is biological, like, it's no more than, you know, a biological component to any other aspect of your identity, such as, like, what, you know, what's your favorite color? Why do you like that color? You know, I could say, well, there's probably something, you know, in your brain that makes you enjoy that color. But that does not mean necessarily that I would argue some, like, essentialist supremacy, like, that, you know, you cannot like the color blue for whatever reason.
What is the biological component to a Sonic the Hedgehog fan? And I know that by saying that, I'm going to have at least one person, the argument is going to probably make an autism joke at that, which, don't. Okay. Not fair. Not cool. But, that said, I've actually heard this from people who are somewhat transmet as well, who will say things like, you know, if being trans is something that happens in the brain, and the brain is biological, then therefore being trans is wholly biological. I'm like, well, that's really reductionist. By that logic, being a fan of a video game is biological. Being, you know, a fan of a sports team is biological. These beliefs, these factors of our identity are biological when you reduce them down that way, and that's just kind of absurd. Though I think a way that I'm going to be going about arguing these points going forward is that when you argue biological essentialism, what you are arguing is biological essentialism only by proxy. What you're really arguing is identity descriptivism. The idea that parts of our identity are prescriptivism, rather, are prescriptive of ourself. What is a male is prescriptive. There's, you know, a set of essential, almost Thomist, for those who are familiar with the fustercluck that is Thomas Aquinas. Almost the Thomist essentialist view of these things. So, like, there's an essential thing to being male. That is what's called prescriptivism. Prescriptivism also is something like, if I'm talking to you about a word and you say, no, that word really means this, and I point out, well, no, I'm using it in this context, it doesn't mean that here. And then you go, no, that word only means this, and it means this, and you keep on going down that route. What you're doing is you're arguing that language is prescriptive, that language is something that we discover, not something we create. Gender, likewise, is something that we create and then discover. Language is something you can discover after it's been created by people. If all human thought was wiped out today, every preconceived notion about what makes a man and what makes a woman would cease existing, and we would have to build those up again from the beginning with what we identify with genitalia and phenotypes and everything. We'd be building it the same way it was built way back when. So when somebody's being a biological essentialist, they are engaging in this prescriptive notion that there are essential traits that are immutable to a person. I'm just going to start arguing gender the same way language is argued. Like, no, this is just like language. This is a thing we made up. But like with language, it is a thing that is useful, regardless of whether or not we made it up.
Yeah, and the other thing too that, like, okay, so if you look back at like essentialism, like back in the old like skeptical days of talking about atheism and that sort of thing, one of the important things is like identify logical fallacies. And one of the other things that they do all the time with essentialism is they do this thing where they're like constantly moving the goalposts. So they started by saying like, your genitalia is what defines you as being permanently like male or female.
And then
we ended up,
and then they learned about chromosomes, and then they learned about gametes, and then they learned about intersex people, and then they learned that that sex was bimodal in the first place. We had two extremes, but we did not have only two options, and then.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's an absurdity, and it boils down to like, they eventually are going to just try to argue that, well, it's your upbringing, how you were raised, like is a portion of this. It's like, well, wait a minute, how you were raised is not in your mind, right? So it couldn't be something just biological. That would be being socialized.
Better say that's external now. That's the same way that we build things like money. Like there's expectations about money and its value that lead to the way that we engage with monetary systems growing up. That's part of the social construction of money. You've basically just got to the point where you're arguing you're defending prescriptivism by arguing descriptivism.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is like, this is like one of their three main like core components to opposing the Equality Act. And it like absolutely falls to pieces under like even the least amount of pressure. You're like, well, that didn't last. It's like, hopefully, they've got a better argument on their other two fronts, which is what, religion and freedom of speech. Do you want to discuss those?
So let's go ahead and do the religion part, because there's probably going to be a lot less to unpack there than with freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is always a very loaded conversation.
Sure. So from my standpoint, I'll see if you agree with us. What they're trying to do is they're trying to take something that is absolutely enshrined in the Constitution and the First Amendment, and they're trying to argue that the First Amendment religious protections grants them the authority to discriminate against other people as long as they have it as a core religious component, where they'll point to the Bible and they'll say like they'll bend and torture the text as much as they need to scoop out discrimination against LGBT people when the Bible, like for instance, never even has the word trans in it, but they'll interpret something else to do it.
Well, it's just like the Bible doesn't argue that you shouldn't own slaves, but then a Christian, because this is what happened when I was on Modern Day Debate, a Christian will then argue, well, the Bible says not to covet what's not rightfully yours, so technically you can't own a slave because they're not rightfully yours, but then they'll bend over backwards to justify owning slaves, because they'll go, well, but you see, the slave is rightfully theirs, even if the two slaves they own have a child that they didn't buy. It's rightfully theirs, so technically it's not coveting. And like, so you're saying the Bible is against slavery because it says don't covet, but it does support slavery because you managed to twist your brain in a knot.
Yeah.
Okay.
The religious granting of slavery is like one of the worst moral blemishes that there is like against Christianity, period. And it's actually like embarrassing to listen to them defend that like inhumane practice on any sort of grounds of morality. I also think it's interesting that whenever you're talking about like this kind of like religious freedoms and everything, the First Amendment was very specific whenever it was saying like, Congress shall make like no law in regards to this. It's like, it's inferring that, you can practice your own religion as long as it's not impacting other people. Like you cannot exercise your freedoms by harming other people, if that makes sense.
So how do you interpret that the Equality Act specifically, or that a conservative will argue, that the Equality Act infringes on their religious freedom. Because, to my knowledge, the way that they'd have to argue that point is to try to find some way in which them... It's like they did with marriage, where they would try to argue that this is an infringement on the institution of marriage, and the institution of marriage is a biblical institution at its very core. I know you mentioned the how the Bible doesn't mention anything about trans people, but how from the conservative perspective do they actually try to argue that this is, this is actually a problem for them? Because the biggest thing for anybody here on the left to handle these issues, we need to be able to look at what a conservative is saying. We need to be able to steel man their argument, and then when the strongest version of their argument exists, then we topple that down. We don't try to make it weaker and then erode it and then kill it. We go, no, here's your argument, and as strong as it exists, how does the Equality Act affect you? How does it infringe on your religious freedoms? And then we beat the shit out of that argument.
Okay, so I think if I'm careful about this, I should be able to steel man them and then melt that bastard down. But what I would say is their steel man position is that, in telling them that they are not allowed to discriminate against a certain group of people that their religious text looks at as reprobate, is essentially forcing them to violate their own values by associating, hiring, or providing healthcare or whatever else for people that their religion normally would not allow them to associate with, and you're coercing them and curtailing their freedoms by saying that the rights of minorities somehow supersede their right to religion, when the right to religion is the First Amendment and therefore very important. And then minority rights you don't see until the 14th Amendment and that sort of thing. And I know it sounds silly, but constitutional originalists, as cringe as that phrase is, they do believe that the order that the Constitution was written is an order of importance. So even the First Amendment, they're oh, look right there, freedom of speech and liberty. That they'll count 1, 2, 3, 4 and say how they're listed in that amendment determines how the founders thought of that importance.
Which, of course, doesn't make any sense when you consider that the way that we actually write laws is an operative way to write laws is to allow as many freedoms as possible to people, and then as we find that somebody being free to do something causes harm on society, then we go, objectively, okay, this causes issue, now we know to legislate against it, instead of trying to prescriptivize laws, basically. That's just my opinion there. So the version of the argument then is freedom of speech is more important than a minority's rights because minority rights come later into the Constitution, which would specifically be an originalist position, not necessarily all conservative positions. Which, trying to get all conservative positions in here is going to be nebulous in the first place, so that's obviously not a thing we can do without calling up Ben Shapiro on the phone and going, hey, talk fallacies to me, daddy.
Oh, no. Well, the reason why I went with constitutional originalist is I figured if you're talking about somebody who's a fundamentalist, as fundamentally close as you can be to arguing that these documents are immutable or whatever else, if we can attack that position, that should be the strongest position, I guess, from a constitutional standpoint. Because if you're more, I hate to say it, liberal conservative, and you're kind of just looking to the further right people for your guidance on these issues, that's who they're talking about. Because Marjorie Taylor Greene, people would say someone like that is closer to being a constitutional originalist because of how she interprets it, even though that's clear, it's not true.
So if we're looking at the originalist position, the way that we have to tackle this then is to ask the originalist, why does the order of events for how the Constitution is interpreted today, why does the order of events matter? Because by the order of events argument, technically the 18th Amendment should be more important than the 21st Amendment, when the 21st, if memory serves, is a repeal of the 18th. Technically, the 18th should be more important.
Yeah,
So
well, I have a different strategy I like to use in going after these types of arguments, and I'll say, well, if you want to talk about like constitutional originalism, right, we would need to look at like the founding fathers and what their opinions were and what they wrote about it, of why they wrote things the way they did, and these sorts of things. And we noticed like very early on that what kind of like what they fundamentally based this on was the idea of like life, liberty, and property, which John Locke wrote extensively about. And, you know, you'll recognize him as kind of one of the architects, along with Jefferson, that ended up being, you know, crucial to penning the documents. And what they thought about it was that the way that we interpret like what like life, liberty, and property, well, by to who, like from where, they believed in something called natural law. And I know there's like a cringy religious, example of it, but there was also basically like this kind of secular idea that every single person like naturally was imbued with a right to life, their liberties, and property. And some philosophical interpretations of that property would interpret like, you know, your body as your property. So if you stick with that kind of interpretation and you look at like the fact that they did add amendments in there so that the constitution could be altered, even if it takes a majority of however many, it doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is they added provisions to change the constitution, and they even said that they knew that the document was not perfect when it was made, because like for instance, Jefferson wanted to write a line in there about abolishing slavery, and that's a whole separate controversy. But later on, 100 years later, we fought or 65 years later, we fought the Civil War. So people have been willing to fight and die for these freedoms. Since the conception of this nation, it's no different now. Minority communities deserve their right to life, liberty, and their property. And by property, I am defining it in the same kind of natural law as the framers of the Constitution, so that your body is like part of your property. That's how I'd argue against an originalist.
I will just go ahead and say, from a socialist perspective, one of my problems with that argument is that property is so ill-defined that it encompasses all private property, when I make a distinction between personal and private property. Because by the ubiquitous property definition, if I gentrify an area and make it to where nobody's able to purchase homes there, kick them all out of their houses, and then buy those houses are as immutable to my person as my own flesh. Well, and I have a lot of problems with that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And this is why I've specifically chosen this, because this is just going to go off into the weeds. But the reason why I did mention John Locke is because I was trying to acknowledge that, philosophically, he was a deontologist. He did acknowledge that there were problems with the conception of property when it comes to stuff like slaves. So then philosophers that came after John that were his the ones that came after him, where they would point out that in some charitable interpretations that he did absolutely mean to include your body and your property, and you could never own someone else's body as your property, as something that as hypocritical as he was, it's something that I could kind of see a very charitable interpretation, especially if you consider later on the same documents and the same ideologies ended up leading to the Civil War, where we ended up.
Hold on, a thing just occurred to me I'm sorry to interrupt, but a thing just occurred to me there. John Locke also had a lot of arguments where contracts were concerned, right? Like, that's where a lot of modern-day libertarians get their ideas that, all contracts are socially valid and they're all operated under consent.
Maybe. I'm sorry. I'm being funny about it because I'm a leftist libertarian, so yeah.
Oh, I'm talking about most of our right wing libertarians, like your Michael Morenos, your freaking what's his name? Your people who call themselves libertarians but end up accidentally being monarchists randomly. Your people like Stephen Molyneux, stuff like that. I'm not talking about libertarian socialist or anarcho-syndicalist, or I'm not talking about this camp. Yeah. But the there's an idea within right-wing libertarianism that, and I believe, maybe I'm wrong, somebody in the chat correct me if I'm wrong, but there's an idea that, like, all contracts, by nature of contracts existing, are operative under consent. So if I sign a contract, I consent to everything in the contract, regardless of the context of when I signed it.
Well, yeah, but remember, when you're talking about natural law, there is also the idea of like positive law. Like that was kind of like the, on the other side of it, which was the idea of like, like the laws that we vote and write for and everything else. And just to be clear, like as far as I understand it, when the founders said natural law, obviously if there's no state there, then you're like, well, there's nobody here to pass like positive laws, therefore there's no governance for us. That's why they have the very basic principle that everyone has like life, liberty, property also including like themselves. And then you say like, well, who will enforce that? And that's where you get to the contract. So then you say, okay, well, you have all these people that share those same beliefs of, the life, liberty, property, get together, form a community, and then they have a cohesive social bond, like where they have like a social contract, where they then later end up developing like, some form of government, whatever else. And then they go ahead and make positive laws to kind of like, govern them how they want to be governed. And if they don't like it, of course, they recognize the right to defend themselves by any means necessary,
Well, the reason that I brought the contract thing was there's a thing that happens with right-wing libertarians a lot, and it's where they'll argue that like things like slavery and stuff is immoral, but then if somebody under duress signs a contract to be a slave for life, because it's either that or they starve to death at that moment. So it's not even a choice for them operatively. It's an ultimatum. It's that or die. So they sign that so that they can extend their life, but they are now a slave for life. I would say that's still not just, because that person should have had the right to food in the first place. Like that right shouldn't have been violated to put them in this situation to begin with. But I'm fairly certain that a right-wing libertarian would argue that under that contract, they did consent to be a slave, and therefore the slavery is completely and totally moral, despite the fact that owning another person should technically be against their code.
Yeah, no, I mean, I see where you're coming from, and I could see like why they would make that argument, but that's just like, if you make any kind of like fallacious appeal to anything else, it's like, look, if you're an originalist and you're saying that you're following the founders and everything else, the founders clearly had a way that they defined property, at least like the thought, like philosophically, and that included your body, and they said that no one could violate your like bodily rights to make you a slave. Like that could never supersede. Now at the time they of course argued that for like white people, but later on very clearly those ideas did spread, and more people became convinced that it was absolutely horrific what they were doing to people of color, and we did have that Civil War. But if I were to attack kind of like the stillman version of their argument that I've created, hopefully I didn't strawman them, I think that I've got some pretty good like reasoning here to argue against them, because I'm arguing from the framers' perspective, which does not gel with their side.
Well, because the framers of the Constitution argued, if memory serves, that it should be more of a living document. Therefore, any of those amendments going through, regardless of their order of events, are part of that living document process. To argue that the 27th Amendment is not as important as the First Amendment, what that leads me to believe is if they would honestly make an argument in that vein, they would be arguing that they love the Founding Fathers so much, but they disagree on literally everything foundationally that they tried to set forth for the Constitution.
Yeah, but when you have people that basically say, I love God, and I'll do whatever my God tells me to. Oh wait, what's that? I have to give up some like minor pleasure that I like. No, I'm not going to do that. Oh wait, I can't do this other immoral thing. Hold on, wait, I'm going to interpret this book to get what I want. It's the same type of fundamentalist that it's always like I was saying earlier. They'll twist and torture the Bible, religious texts. I'm not surprised to do the same thing to the Constitution to make it say what they want it to.
That is entirely fair. So we've got the how it causes issues with their religion, because to them their exercise of religion is part of their First Amendment right. So your position is going to be that one of their strongest positions is likely arguing the importance of the First Amendment through a constitutional originalist perspective, correct?
Yeah, that's where I would attack them, because they think that it's their strongest point when in actuality it has a built-in fatal flaw to it. And a lot of times if they start retreating on that, they, start panicking, because they're like, well, normally this works. Like normally it short circuits, their interlocutor, but it's like you can just answer it right off the bat. So then it's like, okay, well, if they concede that argument, I'm kind of curious, like, what's their next strongest argument?
So for me, I would say that if I were let's LARP a conservative Christian for a second, and let's say that the Equality Act is arguing one of the things the Equality Act, what's one of the actionable things that it does that they are panicked about? Because I can actually probably work a defense around that.
What kind of a defense do you think you could imagine for it?
It depends. I need you to give me something that the Equality Act is actually doing when it's extending these rights to gendered minorities that conservatives panic about, and then I can work up a defense from there. Because for 18 years I was a conservative Christian, so I can fall back into those shoes if I need to for this. But I need something that it is doing, so that I can devil's advocate play their side, so that we can work up a defense for it.
Oh, sure, but I mean, you could say, like, how about right to education?
So, if you have a right to education as an LGBTQ person, and that right to education extends to, say, Catholic private school, or this extends to, like, Pensacola Christian Academy, if you say that PCA can't expel a student for being gay, PCA being the school that I grew up in, their argument is going to be to treat the school as a private industry, which technically it is. And by treating it as a private industry, you are now, as a government, telling that private industry who they can and can't cater to. And what I'm functionally doing is framing the argument on their side the same as the cake argument was framed. You cannot force them to provide a service as a company to an individual, because a lot of this is going to require them to almost grant the company personhood, because you could not force a person to service another individual under the same thing. I think that's how they would go about that.
Yeah, I would point out to them that the cake decision was actually based that you could not be compelled, like someone could not be compelled to make art, and it was specifically because it was interpreted as like art is why they won the case. In the case of the school, I'd point out that the same argument would not hold water if you applied it to like racial minority, where you say like, well, this is a all white Catholic school, unless, as you said, it was it wasn't receiving like federal money or whatever, or it's like some type of private club. I think you can have like whatever private organization you have, and you have entry on that based upon whatever criteria you want. But if you cater to the public, or you accept like federal money, then you do fall under the guidelines of the federal government, and that already applies. When it comes to every other minority category, we're just extending this to trans people as well, or I should say LGBT. But I know that the main focus that they attack right now is mostly trans people.
So I would say that even though if I'm in that side would argue that their right to deny service extends to black people as well. So it would not matter that you are extending, and please note that like this isn't my belief. I'm playing that side to try to steal, man. It's before somebody in the chat like clips me and goes, "Aha, look, Suris the bigot."
Got him.
But yeah. If I did you just take my shoe? Okay, no, she didn't. I thought Growlithe just stole my shoe. The little asshole. Anyway, so I would argue, if I were on that side would likely, because I've had this presented to me before, would likely say, well, we already believe that while it is immoral for an institution to argue that they shouldn't have black people, like if they're an education institution or a private industry or whatever, it is immoral for them to not cater. However, it should not be illegal for them to not cater. They should be allowed to not cater to black people. So even though you are arguing that this is merely an extension of pre-existing legislation, which it is, they're going to argue that, yes, but even that pre-existing legislation I have issues with. That gotcha only works in a world where they agreed with the previous legislation already.
Well, sure, but I mean, like, if we're being realistic about it, at that point, they're arguing, like, mostly just based on their feelings, because the law has already ceded this ground to recognize the rights of minorities. Liberty is already recognized for minorities within the Constitution, and I would say, like, almost the extent of, like, how far you can, push your religion to say, like, you shouldn't be forced to cater to X, individuals. That's already been tested in the courts. So I would grant to them that they could, like, detest LGBT people. They could think that we're gross. They could think that, they wish that we weren't there or whatever else. And honestly, I don't know if I even necessarily care what they think. But once they start expressing it or start taking actions on it, then I care. Because I mean, like, if I'm walking around my daily life, I don't know necessarily what the motivations of anyone I interact with are, or what their biases or prejudices are. Hell, I'm sure I have some biases, even though I try not to kind of like fall, prey to those things. But whatever they're arguing, it's not going to be based on the law. It's going to be based on how they feel about, what they're going to try to present as being coerced into doing something against their will.
So what's going to happen there, and this is where I'm going to have to be a little dishonest. Like, in playing their side, I'm going to have to be dishonest, because that's where this is going to come from. They're going to go, I'm not arguing from my feelings. I'm arguing from like objective morals. Now remember that my last statement was, this isn't about morality, this is about legality. So please keep that as a note when I go, when you point out that they've already lost the legal battle, and they go, well, I'm talking about morally. Morally, this is corrupt. Morally, we should not have to do this. They already had to cede, like, at least my version of the argument, already had to cede earlier that it wasn't about morality, it was about legality. Once you hit them on legality, they have to move to morality. That's a goalpost move. I think at this point, the strategy is just to point out to them, you just swapped the goals. Like, yeah, it was about legality once, and then as soon as you lost, it was about morality. But as soon as I beat you on morality, you're just going to argue that, well, it's not about morality, it's about the legality of the situation. They can play find the fish with this all day.
Yeah, they're just tap dancing at that point. And it does, like, I mean, honestly, it would be a frustrating conversation because, somebody's that motivated to never concede. If they are, if they're a cynic, then it's like no amount of evidence, no amount of argumentation, no amount of anything is necessarily going to move them. They would have to be convinced themselves that they should stop their behavior. And unfortunately, sometimes that does mean wielding the power of the government to pass law to say, you will stop doing this. Otherwise, you're going to face monetary consequences or have your, lose your business or whatever else, depending on if you are flagrantly violating the law.
And I think at that point, I think that we've got a decently strong position here, because for me, and maybe there's a stronger way of doing this, but if I'm LARPing the conservative here, trying to argue against the Equality Act, when I realize that I'm at the point where I'm having to twist myself in mental knots, and I'm having to contradict myself to make my point, to own the libs, as it were, I think at that point it's pretty fair to say I've conceded the point. I've engaged in a tautology. It's moral because it's legal because it's moral because it's legal, that little circular dance. Once I start engaging in that, then it's basic. You can basically just go, look, you don't have a foundation for anything you're doing except feelings. You're done.
Yeah, I'd also be kind of curious, because the next thing that I would go to, if they kept trying to, like, argue along these lines, I would eventually say, like, well, what if, like, people are, like, I don't know, members of the, Temple of Satan or whatever, and it's their religious liberty that they do get to do these things. So now we're pitting, like, 100% pure, like, religious right versus religious right. like religious right to bodily autonomy, religious right to attend whatever school you want to, versus their religion saying you don't get to attend the school because of their religious right. So there has to be something else besides just religion that we can use to determine like where these lines and boundaries ought to be drawn.
I think the reason that I wouldn't want to use religion for this at all, and the reason that I would give to a conservative, is that religious documents, generally speaking, especially if you are an inerrant type of religious person, so let's say you are a conservative Christian who believes that your documents are inerrant. They are immutable, they are perfect. The tricky thing with law is that law has to be adaptive. As we discover that certain things do or don't work, we have to be able to adapt them. And if we base everything on religious doctrine, we don't have the ability to do that anymore. We lose that ability. A fun example of this, you remember what happened in California, I'd imagine, where they changed the legislation over whether or not willingly transferring AIDS to somebody was a felony. They changed it to a misdemeanor, if you remember that.
Yeah.
I remember conservatives getting up in arms about how this is bad, this is horrible, this is terrible. But then the numbers of AIDS cases actually went down after that legislation, because the reason the legislation happened in the first place was an adaptive measure, because people realized that, wait, if I transfer without knowing, then it's not illegal. So if I just don't get tested, then I'm in the clear legally.
Yeah, exactly. But, you know, if you encourage people to get tested and they actually know that they have, they'll communicate to their partners, or they'll actually seek, medical attention. But I also, I think like we could kind of dance all day on discuss, like, debating the religious aspect of it. Do you want to try to take a shot at the freedom of speech and see like where we disagree there or where we agree?
So I think a lot of the freedom of speech part actually got tangled into the religious conversation, because the argument you presented was using the religious conversation as framed as an important factor in freedom of speech for a constitutional originalist. So we actually kind of did that, unless you think there's another angle there we can look at.
I think that we handle that pretty well. The one that I always hear people arguing about is like this. So like, you should be able to say whatever speech you want to at like the workplace. So like you ought to be able to use slurs, whatever else, and not be fired, because that's part of your religious freedom. But I'm sorry, freedom of speech. But I'm pretty sure we covered that pretty thoroughly, because it's like, I would argue like, well, a company has a right to protect its customers, and its customers are internal and external, which would so it's its own employees. And if you've got somebody that's being like bigoted, they're going to be running off your business, everything else. Ultimately, even from like even a liberal would have to see the point that we cannot have people like just randomly using slurs.
There's actually another way to tackle that one that I think is a thing that I like doing. If you notice, I like kind of dumping into the enemy's toes and going, hey, how would I do this if I were them? There's actually a way to do this from their perspective that really fucks with them. So an argument against trans identity is biological essentialism. This idea that the identifying characteristic that somebody has is rooted in their biology, whether it's in the way their brain is functioning or whether it's some other thing. By this logic, if we argue that even identity is biological, we have to accept that things like pain are biological, which of course, to an extent, they are. Like, that's our nerves doing shit. By this framing, mental pain is biological, which means when somebody says a slur that hurts me, they have caused me not harm to my feelings, but biological harm, no different than a punch or a kick. By this framing, a slur is actually a violation on my bodily right to not be harmed by another human being. Whenever they make the argument, my right to swing my fist ends at your nose. Okay, cool. But if you want to argue this biological essentialism bullshit, feelings are now biological. Your right to say a slur ends at my ears now because it causes me pain.
Oh yeah, well, it causes you pain. It could make you end up like quitting your job from like a hostile work environment. You could also like lose business because you're running off customers. So now you're affecting the company's like, bottom line ultimately. And it's like it doesn't help anything. And all it does to do is like make the workplace, I mean, any worse than it already is. And it's like, we don't need that for sure. It's like I don't know, the free speech thing only works, in my opinion, if you're talking about like a public place. It's like, yeah, you can stay down the street corner and wave your stupid signs and like call me names and stuff as I walk by. That's your right. I will grant that. But on private property, when you work for a business, you signed, hey, remember the contract again? They signed an employee agreement with the company that they will not, like you said, harass people or like harm them by, emotionally harming them with their insults.
So we've got about 15 or 20 minutes left in the stream, and I think that's probably going to be just enough, if not barely enough time to tackle the stuff going on with Arkansas. We've talked about the Equality Act and some of the ways in which unfortunately, when it comes to the Equality Act, there's not much more to say than if you already know what protections exist for racial minorities, just add +1 for gender minorities and you've got the Equality Act. Which is why we spent so much time talking about, like, how would we discuss this? How would we defend this? What ways is this going to get attacked by? What ways has this been attacked by conservatives? But let's talk about something that's going on right now, because the Equality Act, as good of a conversation as it is, and as important of a conversation as it is, there is legislation that is being passed right now, not today specifically, but in the modern day, that is trying to fight against this. So I have, and everybody who is watching is going to flip away from Zoe for just a second, though I'm just going to go ahead and say this is the shout out right now. If you have not subscribed to Zoe already, the link is in the description so that you can do so, and I've posted the link into the chat earlier as well, so please go ahead and do it. I noticed that during the stream they gained only 1 subscriber during this, and you can do better than that. So we're going to go ahead and flip this real quick so that we can see. In fact, actually, I think I can do this in a way where Zoe's still seen. We're going to bring up the guest desk, pop, and then we are going to take this, and we're going to take... Where is it? Where is... Hold on. What? Why am I not able to find... there it is, the video overlay.
Yeah, I'll just say, like, definitely thank you for the shout out. And if y'all enjoy, political content, especially like LGBT centered stuff, then definitely, come on over and subscribe. I promise my videos, I try not to just rant endlessly in them. Sometimes it ends up being that sort of thing, but it happens. Just real quick, the last thing I'll say about the Equality Act is that so the Civil Rights Act that gave us those protected categories was passed in 1964, right? So the Equality Act was first actually drafted in 1974, but it never made it to the House. Then in 1994, they tried to pass other LGBT legislation, specifically just to protect employment. That didn't make it through either. So when people want to say like, oh, the Equality Act is just something that, leftists randomly thought up and are pushing because that's the hot new topic. No, we've been fighting for this for like 50 years.
And unfortunately, we will probably continue to be fighting for it for many more years to come, because conservatives like to conserve, well, never actually get in the argument about what they're conserving. That goes down a rabbit hole fast.
Yeah, they're conserving their own personal preferences in their religion. That's pretty much it.
So, what we have here from LGBTQ Nation is Arkansas legislature passes bill to allow EMTs and doctors to refuse to treat LGBTQ people. The proposed legislation that is being called one of the most extreme and deadly anti-LGBTQ healthcare bills seen in years is heading to the governor's desk in Arkansas. For those who want to read along, the bill is SB 289. It is called the Medical Ethics and Diversity Act, seeking to give medical workers a right to refuse providing healthcare to someone because of the worker's religious, moral, or ethical beliefs. Now, I'm going to stop it right there, because there's a thing that I'm already noticing. There's this thing, and we've seen this with, like, the super straight movement, where the new trend right now seems to be to appropriate progressive language. Because when I say Medical Ethics and Diversity Act, if I just say that alone, what does that sound like? It sounds like a good thing. It sounds like it's a great thing. Medical ethics? Yeah, I'm for that. Diversity? Sure. It's to take progressive language and appropriate it to create these abusive scenarios.
That they always call themselves something like the, American Family Council or something like that, where it's like, oh, this sounds like it's, about like community and charity or whatever. And it's like, nope. Bigotry all over again.
So, the bill was previously rejected by the Arkansas House of Public Health and Welfare and Labor over criticism that it was too broad before it passed. That was the issue, was that it was too broad, apparently. But last month it made it out of committee, then has returned with amendments passed to the committee again, passed to the House, and now has finally passed the Senate along mostly partisan lines. 2 House Republicans voted against it passing of the 74 that voted, and 1 Senate Republican. Why would... Okay, so I'm just going to go and say this right now. If you are a worker in the medical field, and you decided to take the job of being an EMT, take the job of saving people, if you're willing to say, no, I don't want to save this person because of my religion, maybe you should retire. Maybe it's time to go ahead and seek that pension out and just fuck right off. We know that this is meant specifically to attack LGBTQ people, and also if you're just cis like me, but you're an atheist, this affects you too, because somebody could literally, from the way this is worded, sounds like somebody could literally just go, you know what? I have a issue with this person, I know they're an atheist. Let's say that they see me and they recognize my face as a content creator. They could just go, you know what? I don't morally agree with this person, and I don't religiously agree with this person, so ethically, I cannot treat this person. They get to die on the operating table. Fuck them. Or they get to give, subpar care, and they can use that as an excuse. I just see a shit ton of problems with this.
Yeah, what if they show up to an accident, because you're talking about EMTs, so they respond to like a bad car accident, and they see that you've got a flying spaghetti monster sticker, or you've got, atheist, memorabilia or whatever else, like, or you, who knows, you have an Islamic, symbol on your car, and they go, oh, wait, I don't want to, pick them up, which is like an absurd violation of the Hippocratic Oath that they're supposed to take. Like, I'm not kidding here. If there's like a nurse that's driving around and they see somebody that's injured and like needs help medically, they are required under that oath to stop and render aid. I'm not kidding. It's bizarre to me that you're saying like now this person can claim like due to some personal ethics that they get to violate their oath and just like let people die or suffer needlessly. It's like the most bizarre twisting of ethics I've ever heard of.
Which, again, when you name it something like the Medical Ethics and Diversity Act, they're going to then say something like, well, this just comes back down to the whole First Amendment and freedom of religion thing. They're going to go, well, my freedom of religion says that I shouldn't be forced to help this person. Again, I think my point here is, I'm willing to grant them that point entirely. I'm willing to say, fuck it. Yes, this is a violation. It is a violation of your religious freedom to be forced to help someone that you don't want to help because of your religious edict. Cool. I'm willing to accept that. But the logical conclusion from that is not, don't help LGBTQ people. The logical conclusion from that is, leave your fucking job.
Yeah, 100%. It's like, if you're saying that you have some personal ethical code, that means that you cannot carry out the Hippocratic Oath, then that means that you should not be a medical professional, essentially.
So, let's go a little further into this article. One of the co-sponsors of the proposal in the State House, Representative Brand Smith, believes that it provides a solution and a remedy to protect the rights of medical workers. So, it provides a solution and remedy here, but what is it a solution for? He claims they need it in order to object from doing certain surgical procedures. So, I think you and I already know what certain surgical procedures means here.
Oh, absolutely. Any kind of like trans care.
This is top and bottom surgery. That's what this is. This is trans surgery. Which, by the way, let me go ahead and point out that if a cis person, under this, if you've got a transphobe doctor who says, I will not help you, cool. Let's say that you're a trans man, you just want to get your titties lopped off, you don't want them anymore, you have no need to have them, that cause you dysphoria, what have you, any number of reasons. They're all valid, doesn't matter for this argument. And you go and say, hey, I'm trans, I can't really comfortably wear binders all day, this actually affects my mental health, like, please, let me go ahead and get this taken care of. This is not just a cosmetic surgery, this is something that is for my well-being. The doctor can then say, no, I have an ethical disagreement with it. But then, a cis woman can come in with back issues and say, hey, I'd like a breast reduction. Or I'd like them cut off because I don't want to use breast cancer as an example because now we have survival, and I feel like that kind of reductio is something that a conservative is going to pounce on. But if a person comes in and just says, I want breast reduction, for any number of reasons, back pain, what have you, the doctor, that same doctor, is not going to have a problem with that. They're just going to go, yeah, no, you want breast reduction? I understand. Cool, we'll do it.
Well, sure. And as Chap pointed out over there, arguably this would also expand the doctors say they have like an ethical objection to something like abortion, which, I mean, could actually end up being an issue. But I just want to point out, like, this is something that, like, I was so frustrated with this because when Trump moved, his administration went to remove like transgender protections like guaranteed by like health insurance companies. I had conservatives saying then that, well, it's just that like certain, whatever, like military and stuff like that ought not be compelled to provide like healthcare for trans people because the surgeries or whatever are expensive, whatever garbage that they came out with. And I said to them then, I said, conservatives will not be satisfied with just denying us insurance. They want to be able to deny us healthcare so that they could like literally decide whether we get to live or die. And all the conservatives I argue with then said, like, that's not true. That's not what's happening. We don't support that. And yet here we are with this bill, along with similar bills that are like trying to, strip our protections away and make us as vulnerable as possible.
Which creates major issues because then you have the conservative that goes, no, I'm for women's rights. And then you go, well, what about a right to an abortion? And then they'll go, the one that I've heard in defense of this is like, well, what if the baby's a girl? I have to fight for that baby's rights too to be in favor of women's rights. Or when you've got somebody who understands that disproportionately African-American women suffer a lot more in many cases by not being able to have an abortion because they don't have things like generational wealth. Statistically, they don't have generational wealth to stand behind the same way that a lot of white Americans do, at least right now. So then when you point out that there's even a racial component to this when they try to deny abortions, they'll go, no, I'm fighting for racial rights. Those are black babies.
Oh yeah, they always have a justification for this. It's like they want to remove as many protections as possible from minority groups, deny us access to healthcare, like make our lives as miserable as possible, while also claiming that they have the moral high ground simply because they want to force women to have babies that they either don't necessarily want or are concerned of carrying to full term, whatever the motivation is.
So let's go a little further and see how much of this... Okay, we don't really have much left of this, which works out because we're running out of time anyways. So the bill says that a healthcare professional could sue their employer if they feel like they're being forced to provide healthcare that they don't want to. And the bill says that the exemption applies even if a procedure is deemed necessary for a patient. So even if, let's say that you are a trans woman, or trans man, you're a AFAB trans man, and you are having this top surgery, but you're having the top surgery because you had breast cancer. So now it is considered medically necessary, even under a transphobe's definition of medically necessary. However, because it's a trans person, the person can then go, well, I'm just going to sue my employer because they made me give top surgery to a trans person. Ignore the fact that the surgery was given because of cancer.
Yeah, it's outrageous, and it's like you were saying earlier. Like I could take any number of examples and say, like, let's say for instance that like a cis person for some reason suffered some injury to their body, like that damaged their breasts or their bottom half, and they're like, oh, we're going to quickly do some reconstructive surgery to try and restore this person back to where they should be. It's like, well, why wouldn't you just do the same thing for a trans person? And it's like, under this bill, they'd say, oh, wait, no, that trans person that got like mangled and injured, we're not going to do anything for them. Just let them die.
Also, to the person in the chat that says that the Hippocratic Oath explicitly forbids abortion, first of all, the Hippocratic Oath is not a legal distinction. It is purely a social thing. Secondly, yes, the original version of the oath says that, but the modern version of the oath actually has no compunction for abortion at all. So, that said.
Yeah, it's just, I was trying, like, I know I had kind of like pointed out the abortion thing earlier, but I was trying not to, I was like, this is going to end up being like a lengthy discussion, and I know that, it's about time to go, I think.
Just a little bit. Though I will say, I'm going to go and read it out here. Let me see here if I have I actually have the second oath pulled up on my phone, but the way it's formatted, it cuts things off, and I don't know why. But yeah.
I also I dated a nurse for like 7 years, and I was there at the ceremony when all the students took the Hippocratic Oath. It said nothing about abortion in the modern one.
Well, no, because the original one was like to Apollo, like it's very old. And it has been updated since then.
Yeah, and I know we don't have a lot of time to go into this, but I mean, I would say like we can't even establish necessarily like where personhood and all that kind of stuff starts scientifically. So, like, I mean, technically you could say, oh, well, what are you aborting? As long as you're aborting a pregnancy, right? I don't know.
I mean, you could do that, but maybe it's just my if you've noticed, I have a habit of trying to steelman the argument as much as possible. I actually like arguing from the personhood perspective. I like arguing that it's a person from conception. Like once it's more than a single cell, cool. We'll just call it a person then, because I actually have no problem arguing from that perspective, which really gets under some conservatives' skins, because they're like, wait, are you arguing for killing a baby? And I'm like, technically I am, and I'm fine with that. Let's go.
Yeah. Well, the way that I'd like to do the same thing. I'll fight, from bodily autonomy. And I'm just like, look, no one gets to use your body against your will, no matter their age. Why would we make an exception just because somebody is like excessively young?
Massimo says, what is steel manning? Steel manning? Oh my gosh, Growlithe. That's one reason that I'm having to hop out here in a second. Steel manning is when you take an argument and you try to present it back to somebody in as strong as humanly possible. Whereas straw manning is presenting a weakened version of an argument, steel manning is presenting the strongest version of that argument possible. A straw-manned argument can be taken down easily because it's weak. A steel-manned argument is harder to take down, but because a steel man is necessarily strong as, if not stronger, than the argument that was proposed to you, if you can beat a steel-manned argument, there's usually not something someone can throw at you from their side of the conversation that's going to beat out what you have to say.
Yeah, exactly. And when you tear that down, a lot of times, like, when you pull it apart, you're going to notice, like, a shift in the dialect immediately as your opponent starts to realize, like, they're in some deep shit. Oh, he's going to go get the dog. Hi, chat. I'm still here with you, at least for a little while. Hopefully you've enjoyed this this conversation. It's been entertaining. It's, I guess, one of my first, like, recorded streams, so this will be interesting.
Ugh. And I just had to do the thing where I rushed to the other side of the house to let Growlithe out, because I am fairly certain those were I need to go to the bathroom noises.
Oh yeah, no, it's fine. I've got a dog like almost the size of a Great Dane, so it's like, yeah, when she starts, like, like growling and moaning and just, it's like, okay, it's time to let her outside.
It's time to go.
Yeah.
All right. So with that said, everybody, if you are in chat and you have not done so already, please do me the biggest of favors. And please go ahead and subscribe to Zoe. There is a link in the description there. Should be the very first link you can click. Please do so, and let's go ahead and thank Zoe for giving their time and talking about the Equality Act, playing a little bit of debate ball with each other, and getting into some of the crap going on in Arkansas.
Yeah, it was definitely fun. It was nice meeting you, chat, and maybe we could do it again sometime later.
Hopefully. That said, I'm going to go ahead and let you go, and we're going to do just a tiny bit of post-chat before ending things out.